Hey everybody, back again to talk about chapter 12. We finished up chapter 11 in the last video, on the eve or on the verge of starting the War of 1812. And in this chapter, we are going to pick up with the beginning of the War of 1812 and a few more major historical issues like the Missouri Compromise and the Monroe Doctrine. One thing before I go farther into the video, I do want to make sure that, when I know that the last couple of videos I posted have been very long. Again, keep in mind that I'm covering an entire chapter in one video, and even if the video is an hour and a half long, our regular classes, when I lecture for about 45 minutes. Well, I also might only cover 3, maybe 4 slides. I've been covering 16, 17, 18 slides in an hour and 15, hour and 30 minutes. I don't expect you all to watch these videos all in, one go. I fully expect a lot of you to not even watch the entire video. I'm just putting videos out there with the lecture, so it's additional explanation beyond just reading the slides off of the PowerPoints. That way, if you read through, when I give the assignment to read slides 6 through 12, or whatever the case might be, if there's something that doesn't really come across very clear, when I type these up, I mean, it made sense to me when I typed it up. But if I have a typo, or if maybe something that I have on one of the slides isn't clear to you when you read through it, I'm just putting the videos out here so you can, even if you fast forward through the video to get to the slide where there was an issue that, something that you didn't understand or wasn't clear enough for you, you can just listen to that section if you want to, or if you want to listen to the whole thing, it's all there. Another thing about the lecture notes, the PowerPoints that I put on our Google Classroom for Unit 4, Chapter 10, the Chapter 10 PowerPoint that's in the Unit 4 resources is the same that I used in my video. The Chapter 11 and Chapter 12 notes that I used in these videos are in the Google Classroom, but there's also a 4th PowerPoint that says Chapter 11, Chapter 12 recap, and those are much more abbreviated versions of the notes, where I really only hit the high points. I've just put that in there because I had it in my unit folder of files, and I just put it into the resource folder on the Google Classroom because it's something that I had used in the past. It's got all the same material that's in the full length lecture notes. It's just the full length notes I cut. For example, in the recap chapter 12, I think I only put, or I narrowed everything down to maybe 8 or 9 slides, whereas the full lecture notes for this chapter, I've got 18 slides, including the title slide. So, I did pare down quite a bit of information. So I'm using these, though, the full notes, because I've got the time to make the videos, and it's just an opportunity to give you all access to more information. Again, regardless of which set of notes you're looking over, all the information comes out of our book, The American Pageant. So it's there for you, whether you choose to use it or not, I guess. All right, so let's get on into the War of 1812. Like I said, when we finished up with the last chapter, going into war with Great Britain here, it could either pay off really big for the United States, or it could be an absolute disaster. If we are successful, this could really change the way that other nations, specifically European powers, look at the United States. If things don't go well for us, it could be a disaster, because we might end up being British colonies once again. So that's one of the reasons why the War of 1812 a lot of times is referred to as the Second War for American Independence. Now, another thing about the War of 1812, even though there was quite a bit of support for the war with Britain, it was, you know, it was divisive throughout the country. There were certain regions that really pushed for the war, and there were certain regions that pushed against the war. In the West and the South, there was a lot of support for a war against Britain. In the Northeast, a lot of people tended to be against the war with the British. They might have been more accepting of a conflict with the French, but not the British, because think about the regions that I'm talking about here in the first bullet. In the West and the South, this is really the frontier region. And what is an issue that I talked about in the last chapter? Settlers moving farther west, or moving it, you know, more heavily populating the South, and Native Americans along the frontier. I mean, this has been an issue that colonists or Americans have dealt with since the early 1600s. If you lived on the frontier, as settlers pushed farther west, they're moving into Indian territory, and, you know, we're basically taking their land. That's going to lead to conflict. Well, a problem that we run into with the British is that the British on the frontier had been arming the Native Americans that we were not on good relations with. So that's why people in the West and the South were really pushing for war, is because that was a major issue they had with the British, that the British were arming the natives that, you know, we were coming into contact with. I wouldn't just say that we're attacking our settlements, because we also used violence to drive them off the land so we could settle it. In the Northeast, they tended to be against British, a war with the British, because where was all of our industry? All of our industry, all of our factories were in the North, in New England, the Northeast. And who was our biggest trade partner? The British. So we go to war with Great Britain again, and that means the nation is losing its biggest trade partner, which we had just gotten to the point where we were repairing our relationship with the British after the Revolution. Now, another reason that they might have been against the war in the Northeast is because they're going, you know, the Northeast is going to be put in the crosshairs, because while the British did have military outposts, they did have trade posts throughout America as a result of the Treaty of Paris in 1783 that ended the American Revolution. Canada was in the north. What is the closest part of America to the colony of Canada? New York, the New England states. So you see why different regions had different outlooks on whether they wanted or did not want this war with Great Britain. Because you had different groups of people in different parts of the country that wanted different things, the war was very disorganized. Also, it wasn't as long and as drawn out as the American Revolution was. You know, the American Revolution started in 1775 and it ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1783. You know, the War of 1812 started in 1812, and oddly enough, that's why they called it the War of 1812. But also by the end of 1814, beginning of 1815, the war was over with. But being a disorganized war, it's because you had fighting that was going on in the Northeast. You had fighting that was going on in the Great Lakes region to the west. You had fighting that was going on in the South. And it's almost like the areas where the fighting was taking place, it's like three different wars were being fought. That's what led to it being very disorganized. Another thing is that early on in the war, kind of like with any sport, you know, basketball, football, baseball, soccer, you know, when you get your season started, you would like to have some victories to get some momentum built, to get things moving in a positive direction. Well, it's one of those things where you look at colonial history, American history, and I've talked about this in previous videos. I've talked about it in lectures in class. Again, we decide to invade Canada. It has only really worked for us once throughout colonial / American history, and the thought was, I mean, this was a major British, settlement in North America. It was a threat to the United States, but we invaded Canada in hopes of gaining more territory, expanding the size of the United States, like we had already done with the American Revolution, the Louisiana Purchase. But we ended up going at it in a way that ends up, we should have known, again, the reason we study history is so hopefully some people will learn from past experiences, good or bad. One thing you can do is learn from your mistakes, but you can also learn from things that worked in the past. Well, if you look back to the French and Indian War, the one time that a colonial or an American invasion of Canada was successful, what did we do? In the French and Indian War, we take Fort Louisburg, we take Quebec, then we take Montreal. You take those major fortifications, those major settlements, it cuts off the distribution of soldiers, reinforcements, and it cuts supply lines to the smaller settlements farther to the west, in the Canadian frontier or in the Great Lakes region that was also, it was frontier for us, but it was also frontier for the British. Well, what do we do instead of taking Montreal? If we had attacked Montreal and been successful in taking the Montreal settlement, that would have cut off supplies, that would have cut off reinforcements to Western settlements, like the fort at Detroit, Niagara, at the falls, the British controlled Niagara Falls. If we could have taken Montreal, it would have made later attacks on Detroit, Niagara, and Lake Champlain, all of which were were losses for us. So it's kind of like with a sports team of whatever your favorite sport is, starting off the season on a losing streak. It's usually not usually don't have a positive outcome if you start off on a losing streak. Well, we start off the war here. We lose at Detroit. We lose at Niagara. We lose at Lake Champlain, and it looks kind of rough. Very quickly into the war, it looks like we very well could become colonies again. But after those initial defeats, we do have a series. I guess again, putting it in sports terms, we were streaky. We start off on a losing streak, but then we start to have a series of at least mild to moderate successes that, again, it starts to reverse. The negative momentum becomes positive. Oliver Hazard Perry ended up building a fleet of ships that would be used along the Great Lakes. He builds them in Lake Erie, wins a battle there, gains American control of Lake Erie. Then he starts moving, through the other Great Lakes. He's able to help between a naval force that he put together and land forces. We're able to push the British out of Detroit. So you have Lake Erie, or I guess for you all, I have to flip my sides. You have Lake Erie, and then you have Detroit here. That drives the British out of Lake Erie. It drives the British out of Detroit. Pretty much gives us a good hold on the Great Lakes region at this point. Then a little bit farther to the south, William Henry Harrison, who I talked about earlier, old Tippecanoe, will eventually become president of the United States, but still, he was a renowned Indian fighter, and he had fought against Tecumseh and his brother, the Prophet, Shawnee leaders that had created a coalition to fight against American settlers in the frontier. Well, here during the War of 1812, Tecumseh and the Shawnee had ended up siding with the British. Harrison ends up engaging and defeating the British and Native American forces at the Battle of the Thames, and Tecumseh ends up being killed. After Tecumseh dies, there really wasn't a Native American leader to step up and really fully fill the void that was left by Tecumseh's death. So the Native Americans still continue to be an aid for the British because they viewed American Western settlement as a larger threat than any encroachment by the British. So they side with the British because they see us as a bigger threat moving west. But after the Battle of the Thames, the British become the main threat because after Tecumseh's death, the Native Americans aren't as big of an influence or as big of a threat as they had been before his death. Now, the British had planned to attack New York City by the Hudson River again, just like the American Revolution. The Hudson River strategically is going to be very important because whoever controls the Hudson is going to control the ability to move troops east to west, cut off New England from, the rest of the states, cut New England on the Atlantic coast off from, New York and the frontier to the west. Captain Thomas MacDonough ends up engaging the British and pulling out a victory there. We maintain control of the Hudson. That's going to allow us to continue to move our forces east to west. It saves New York, it saves New England, keeps New England from being cut off from everything else. And again, it's a failure of the British to push farther down into American territory. Then you start to see the war turn. I mean, fighting is going to continue in the Northeast, in the Great Lakes region, but we have fair control of those regions. You're going to see the war turn towards the Chesapeake Bay area. The British Navy, they're going to bring their ships down from docks in Canada or even from across the Atlantic they could, and they're going to attack up and down the American Atlantic coast. They end up the British end up landing at Bladensburg, and they march on Washington, D.C. Because our focus had been fighting in the north, Washington, D.C. wasn't as prepared maybe as it should have been, to protect our capital. The British end up taking Washington, D.C., and they burn our new capital to the ground. The British end up being stopped at Fort McHenry, which was a military installation just outside of the city of Baltimore, and the battle at Fort McHenry ended up being the inspiration for Francis Scott Key's writing of the Star-Spangled Banner, which eventually does get adopted as our national anthem. The British then are going to target the city of New Orleans, which was also a very important. We had just paid. We had tried to buy New Orleans for $10 million from the French in 1803. Napoleon wouldn't sell just New Orleans. So what ends up happening is he sold us the entire Louisiana territory for $15 million. To him, it was just a way to make money for him to use here. Well, even by this point, he had started his war in Europe. But New Orleans was really important to the United States because it gave us access to the Gulf of Mexico. It gave us a western port. So any settlers that live west of the Appalachian Mountains, even if they're having to travel hundreds of miles more than they would have by crossing the Appalachians to get into those, the 13 states on the other side of the Appalachian mountain chain, it was easier for people in the West because it was very difficult to traverse the mountains, much less if you're transporting agricultural goods. It was easier to hop on a skiff, hop on a boat, go down the Ohio River, hit the Mississippi River ride the current down the Mississippi, make it to New Orleans, sell your goods off in a market there in New Orleans. Merchants would load ships in the Gulf, take it out of the Gulf around Florida up to the Atlantic coast, and they would sell it in larger markets along the American East Coast. So the British end up setting their target on New Orleans. That puts the Mississippi Valley in danger. Andrew Jackson, who had been commanding troops in the South, he was born in Tennessee. He, again, just like William Henry Harrison, had a reputation as an Indian fighter. He had shortly before just won a major battle against natives at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in Alabama. And when they get word that the British are moving on New Orleans, he moves an army of about 7,000 troops, and this was a ragtag bunch. It wasn't even militia. Some of it was professional soldiers, U.S. Army troops. Some of it was militia. Some of it was Frenchmen that were fighting with us because they hated the British. You had black troops, former slaves or slaves that were fighting against the British at the behest of their owners, which was extremely unheard of at this time, to allow African Americans to fight one way or another, because the vast majority of African Americans were slaves, and in the eyes of slave owners, the worst thing you could do would be to arm them. But again, this was a ragtag bunch. It was not a 7,000 strong, formally trained part of the U.S. Army. Again, it was troops in the Army. It was sailors, part of the U.S. Navy. In some cases, it was pirates or privateers. If you want to use a nicer term, pirates are outlaws. Privateers are essentially pirates with better PR skills that have government approval, basically. And then, like I said, you had some French that lived in Louisiana fighting with us because our enemy was the British, state militias, but they're all following Andrew Jackson. The most famous battle of the War of 1812 ends up being the Battle of New Orleans. January 1815, the Battle of New Orleans. Jackson and his 7,000 man force ends up defeating 8,000 British regulars. It was the largest battle of the war. It's the most famous battle of the war. Andrew Jackson is credited with winning the war for the Americans. But if you look down here at the sub-bullet, Jackson, and again, you have to keep in mind at this point in history, news traveled much more slowly than it does today because of the internet, because of social media. If something happens on one side of the world today, within a matter of minutes, it's posted on the internet and people know what's going on the other side of the world. It didn't work like that in 1815. It turns out that the Treaty of Ghent actually ended the war between the United States and Great Britain 2 weeks before the Battle of New Orleans took place. But because this was taking place, Ghent is in Europe. So the treaty was signed in Europe. Well, it took weeks, like on the span of, a month and a half, 2 months, to get news across the Atlantic. Then you have to factor in the way that information trickled from the port cities along the Atlantic coast, along the, across the U.S. We're in the back country here. We're in the, even though New Orleans was a major port city, it's still far out west. This is the American frontier. So not only did the Battle of New Orleans take place 2 weeks after the war officially ended with the signing of the ceasefire, the Treaty of Ghent, there were probably skirmishes for weeks after. They just weren't, nearly on the scale of the Battle of New Orleans. Jackson is still in newspapers given credit for winning the war. He becomes a national hero. Eventually, he's going to become president of the United States. And part of that is going to be based off of his popularity because he was a national hero from the Battle of New Orleans. But it's still funny that he gets credit for winning the war for the United States, but officially the war had ended 2 weeks before that battle even took place. It was still an important victory because it was a decisive victory on the part of the Americans against. And like I said, he did not have 7,000 fully formally trained, soldiers in the U.S. Army. This was a mishmash, like I say in the notes, a mosaic of troops. Whereas the army that he fought were 8,000. I mean, he was outnumbered, and he fought 8,000 professional British soldiers. Now, the British Navy really starts to get involved at this point. If they manage to block the American coast, if they use their Navy to land, this could be a big problem for the United States because they had the biggest Navy in the world, the most powerful Navy in the world, and we still did not have much of a Navy to speak of. They were able to land up and down the coast. They could attack coastal settlements at will, go back to their ships, move, redeploy somewhere else. It destroyed the fishing industry for the United States for, at least for the length of the war. Moving to the treaty itself, the delegates met in Ghent, which was in Belgium. They worked out a peace agreement. The British, they wanted a buffer zone that would be considered Indian territory. They wanted control of the Great Lakes. They wanted part of the state of Maine, which of course, we reject all of that. Because they had been beaten at Detroit, because they had failed to take the Hudson River, because they were losing out west, even though the Battle of New Orleans hadn't taken place yet, the fact that the United States forces had dealt the British several significant defeats over the past 2 years, it made the British a little more pliable. It made them more flexible, more accepting of a bargain. The Treaty of Ghent ends up being signed, near the end of December in 1814, and both sides agree to lay down their arms. No land was given, no land was taken. The main issue of the war, impressment, which had been an issue between the United States and Great Britain now for, honestly, at this point, close to 20 years, it wasn't even mentioned in the treaty. This was basically just an armistice, a ceasefire to stop the fighting that was the War of 1812. But the United States comes out on top. We remain independent. Like I said, this could have gone extremely bad had, things not gone the way that they had. I mean, we could have been retaken as colonies for the British, but since we had had several significant victories, this is considered a overall victory for the United States. And from that point forward, you do start to see, after 2 American defeats of the British, this time without significant foreign aid like we had during the American Revolution, the British accept our independence truly, and we start moving towards being more allies than opponents. Now, going back to more just American business, you have the Hartford Convention called in December of 1814, and it ends up running into January of 1815. You had delegates from several New England states, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Hampshire, Vermont, Rhode Island, all meet in Hartford, Connecticut. This was New England's, the goal here was to decide what New England as a region wanted to do about the war. There was some talk of secession from the United States because, they felt that they were left out on a limb. And again, when the British attacked the Hudson, they almost got cut off from the rest of the country. They called for money from Washington, from the Capitol. They wanted to require a 2/3 majority vote for any embargo, any new state, or vote of war in Congress. This was a bad time. When I say it was, the timing of their proposal was terrible, it's because this is going on when the war is formally coming to an end. The reason that they were threatening talk about secession is they felt that the South and the West were wielding too much influence in Washington, and the industrial leaders, the manufacturers, the people that were suffering financially because of the war in New England, they wanted to swing it in their favor to where they would have more influence. That's why they wanted Congress to have to require a 2/3 vote for any embargo on trade with foreign nations, the acceptance of a new state into the Union, because where a new state's going to come from, the West or the South, or a call to war, because again, your economy suffers financially whenever you go into a war. And just like as we go into the Civil War in 1861, the bulk of our economy, the bulk of the nation's wealth is coming out of the North, out of New England. The reason I say that the timing was terrible is because within just, really before the convention's over with, news of Jackson's victory in New Orleans, news of the formal end of the war, even though it was signed in December of 1814, it's not going to be until well into January that the news makes it back across the Atlantic. It makes the New England states look bad to have threatened secession from the Union and saying, well, we want this, we want this, we want this, or we're going to withdraw from the United States. And then the United States ends up winning the war and forcing the British into accepting a treaty. It makes them look unpatriotic. It just makes them look bad all around to the rest of the nation. So the importance of the War of 1812 basically comes down to the Americans, since they don't really pick up any land, they win respect, specifically from Britain, but bigger picture, the rest of Europe. We're no longer looked at as those former colonies. We are going to be looked at as a true nation. We're still not a world power, but they look at us as a real nation in our own right, not just a set of former British colonies. We're now considered a credible nation. It showed that, to the British, to the French, to whoever else was watching, that we weren't going to be bullied. We did get bullied for the mid to late 1790s, the early 1800s. You can look at the War of 1812 as America standing up for itself. So the big takeaway here from this war, even though it was disorganized, it was poorly planned, in a lot of cases poorly carried out, we gained respect. And at this point in time, that was probably something that we needed more than more land. We still had more land with the Louisiana Purchase or Louisiana Territory. We still had more land than we knew what to do with. We didn't need Canada. What we did need is respect from European nations so they didn't continue to test us and pick at us, especially along our frontier. Other effects of the war is, by this point, the Federalist Party is all but done. Within a couple of years, the Federalist Party basically won't exist anymore. We have at least two major national heroes. Andrew Jackson and William Henry Harrison eventually would both become presidents. They made their names for to the American people. They made their names during the War of 1812. You have because this was even though we didn't win land, we didn't make, we weren't paid money by the British. The respect that we gained, and because this was such a significant victory for what would still be considered a young nation, you see a huge surge in American pride, in patriotism, national pride. This was probably at this point the tightest feeling of national unity that our country has had up to this point, even more so than the American Revolution. Because, like I talked about before in class, after the American Revolution, as soon as the threat of the British was over in 1783, we go back to a situation where the 13 independent states are just that. They're worried about themselves and they're not really worried about their neighbors. It's, our home state comes first. Well, now after this victory against the British, now we're really starting to look at ourselves as a whole, as a nation. This is really, truly when you could call us for the first time the United States of America. 1817, you end up having the Rush-Bagot Agreement. This reduces the naval presence along the Great Lakes of both the U.S. and the British. It showed that now that we were a couple of years past this military engagement, we were starting to move towards forming maybe not an alliance, but that we were a former set of colonies of Great Britain, and with this agreement to reduce naval resources on both sides, a bilateral agreement to reduce our naval power in the Great Lakes, it shows that the United States and Great Britain, we're going to get along easily, and very quickly we are going to be looked at as close allies. At this point, we might not be close allies, but we're getting there. To this day, the United States and Canada have the world's longest unfortified border in the world. 5,527 total miles. When you factor in the continental United States and the border between Alaska and Canada, we do not have fortifications along any of that border. For America, this had sent a message to the rest of the countries of Europe. They're not really going to test us, be it the English, be it the French, the Spanish. And now you're going to see for the next several decades, the Americans, the American government, the American people, instead of trying to get noticed by European powers or getting pushed around, getting tested by the European powers, now that they've backed off, we're going to focus on building our country up from the inside. We're going to start to look westward in terms of expansion and settlement. Now, I'd mentioned the three branches of government and the expansion of the powers of the Supreme Court after the Constitution was written. Even though the Supreme Court was established with the Constitution being adopted, ratified in 1789, you're really not going to see until 1803 that the Supreme Court really asserts its authority in terms of maintaining checks and balances and the balance of power between our three branches of government. In 1801, the Judiciary Act was passed that created 16 new federal court districts. President John Adams, in the last couple of hours of his presidency, I'm talking about working through the night, signing and approving appointments, Federalist John Adams ends up appointing conservative, Federalist supporting judges to these federal court positions. This is referred to as court packing. When an outgoing president ends up trying to get as many appointments from his end of the political spectrum as possible. So even if the federal, or to use more modern terms, Republican, Democrat, we have an outgoing Republican president and there are open positions that need to be filled, well, you're going to hear Democrats say those positions don't need to be filled until the new president takes office. you're going to hear Republicans say, no, these positions need to be filled now because they are vacant. Well, what it is if the outgoing president's a Republican, the incoming president's a Democrat, the Republican Party as a whole wants those positions, the appointments made by a Republican president are going to tend to be conservative judges. So even if they lose, that party loses the White House and you have a more liberal Democrat take their place, well, if those judges have already taken their oath and taken the bench, those are lifetime appointments. So that's going to maintain a conservative influence in the balance of power, even if they are losing, what we would look at as a nation as the most powerful individual spot in our entire government. But that's a problem that Americans have a lot of times, is there are a lot of people that still don't realize that the president does not run our country. The president is the chief executive. He's the head of the executive branch, but because of the system of government we have in place, the president doesn't have all of the power. He shares power with Congress. He shares power with the Supreme Court. But these judges that President Adams ended up signing into their appointments were referred to as midnight judges because literally it was the middle of the night on the last day that he was president of the United States that they get their appointment. Chief Justice John Marshall ends up proving to be an extremely strong Federalist or conservative supporter for Federalist causes as we move forward. The first major Supreme Court case, and this is something you do need to remember, it could show up on a test at the end of the unit. It could show up at any point later on in the year. Marbury versus Madison, 1803. This ends up being a major case because this is the first time the Supreme Court ever exercises the power of judicial review. The power of the Supreme Court to review the constitutionality of a law or of a decision and to either keep it intact or to strike it as unconstitutional. This sets a precedent, and from that point forward, this is when you're going to see the Supreme Court step in, and it might be looking at a law, looking at a tax or something like that, an appeal to an earlier court decision. Judicial review ends up becoming probably the most significant power that the Supreme Court has in terms of our balance of power between the three branches. Now, I said that you see a boom in nationalism and patriotism after the War of 1812. You start to see American literary culture really start to establish itself. Some of our earliest famous American writers, Washington Irving, James Fenimore Cooper, who, if you've ever read Last of the Mohicans, that's probably what he's best known for. Before this point, American writings that had gained fame had really focused on, political treaties, stuff that was written by our founding fathers during the Revolutionary era, things like Thomas Paine's Common Sense. Even though it might not have the same significance as these pieces of literature mentioned by Irving or Cooper, or the political significance of something like Common Sense. Poor Richard's Almanac by Benjamin Franklin. It was one of the few books, other than the Bible. The Bible was the most popular book. I mean, even if you had a family of people that could not read in America, they probably still had a Bible in their house. If you did have people that could read after the Bible, Poor Richard's Almanac was the next most popular book in the United States for years, and it was produced annually. And it wasn't so much written by Benjamin Franklin as it was edited by him, but it carried his name. Or not that his name was Richard. Everybody knew Benjamin Franklin's the one that put Poor Richard's Almanac together. And because of his status as one of our founding fathers, that carried a lot of weight, and that's why Poor Richard's Almanac was so popular. Fiction had never really been, up until this point, fiction had never really been an area that American writers, really ventured into. In the years following the War of 1812, or after the burning of Washington, D.C., the city ends up being rebuilt. Our military force, because we had now fought a second war against Britain on our own soil, we see again it's time to undo what Thomas Jefferson had done and rebuild, strengthen the American military, continue to rebuild the U.S. Navy, rebuild the Army. But because we look to avoid international conflicts from this point forward, you're still not going to see a large standing army in the United States all the way up to the Civil War. As we go into the Civil War, I talked about how under Thomas Jefferson in the early 1800s, we only had a standing army of about 2,500 men. When we get to the Civil War, we still only have a standing army of about 15,000 American troops. And as of 1861, most of those were out west dealing with Native American conflicts. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is the American system. After the War of 1812, America was swamped with cheap imports because when embargoes come to an end and the fighting comes to an end, trade picks right back up. By the time you get into 1815, 1816, Europe was well underway in terms of an industrial revolution. The United States had not gotten to that point yet. So things that are being mass produced, now that things are becoming, production's becoming more mechanized in Europe, we're flooded with British, with French, with German, Belgian imports. So what we have to do to protect American industry is Congress has to pass some tariffs, some protective taxes. The tariff of 1816 assesses a tax rate of about 20 to 25% on imports. This basically what this is doing is it's a tax that's paid on the value of whatever foreign goods are brought in. It artificially raises the price, and in this case, it's artificially raising the price by 20 to 25%. So you're increasing the price of that good because merchants aren't going to pay that tax and then just take that as a loss. They're going to end up increasing the price of that good to cover the tax they have to pay. So this is a way to protect American industry and American production by artificially increasing the prices of foreign goods by a quarter or a fifth, 20 to 25%. This was America's first tariff on foreign goods, and it's because we were getting swamped with cheap foreign imports. We couldn't produce the goods as cheaply as Americans could buy them from European producers that had industrialized. Henry Clay from Kentucky, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, and this initiated what he called the American system, had three proposals. First was a banking system, second was a protective tariff, and the third was a strong transportation network. We needed to strengthen our infrastructure because there is a huge divide between population that lives east of the Appalachian Mountains. Again, I'm getting my sides flipped. East of the Appalachian Mountains for you all, west of the Appalachian Mountains, between the Appalachians and the Mississippi River, or west of the Mississippi. The protective tariff is going to protect us, just like I talked about, from foreign imports. And again, Henry Clay is a proponent of keeping a national banking system in place because Alexander Hamilton's Bank of the United States, it ends up, let's see, trying to think of, it would have been renewed a couple of years earlier from what we're talking about here. Again, it ends up being extended for another 20 years. So his push is to keep a national banking system, more protective tariffs, and to improve transportation, building roads, building canals to make transportation of goods easier to get them to market. So production costs drop, transportation costs drop, so American goods are cheaper and it's a more viable, more competitive price to fight against the fact that these European goods are so cheap. Clay asked for federal money for internal improvements. Again, this is for infrastructure, for transportation, to build roads, build canals. President Madison ends up vetoing the bill. People that opposed Clay's bill, the big complaint is that these things weren't in the Constitution, that they should be handled by the states because they would fall under the 10th Amendment. Again, it comes down to that strict interpretation of the Constitution versus a loose interpretation of the Constitution. The people that opposed Clay's American system and the bill that would have provided money for it, they were strict interpreters of the Constitution. And they're like, we don't want to pay for this. We don't want tax money to go to this. So this would fall under the 10th Amendment. The states have to take care of their own transportation. Some states go ahead and they start funding improvements to transportation. For example, New York ends up digging the Erie Canal in 1825. The state of New York funded the building of the Erie Canal to connect the Erie to, the other Great Lakes. Like I said, the Federalist Party had basically ceased to exist as a result of the War of 1812. The election of 1816 comes along, and James Monroe ends up being elected president. This is referred to as the era of good feelings because the Federalist Party has ceased to exist by this point. So there's only one political party, the Democratic Republicans. We're still riding this wave of nationalism, national pride, but it's called the era of good feelings, and there's only one official political party. Everybody was a Democratic Republican, but now we have what is referred to as sectionalism. Everybody's of the same political party, but different politicians from different regions of the country, the South, the West, New England. They all have different goals. So they're all part of the same political party, but now you have a Western candidate, you have a Southern candidate, you have a Northern candidate. Southern states claim that tariffs only benefited the North, where all the manufacturing, where all the industry was, and it just made the South pay higher prices. They also, they disliked internal improvements that linked the North to the West. Raw materials in the West being linked by roads, by canals, to the manufacturing centers in the North. The Southerners felt like they are being neglected. You're seeing a trend here from this point forward. This is 1816, 1817, and the South feels like it's being neglected by the rest of the nation, by Washington in particular. That resentment, that chip on the South's shoulder, so to speak, is something that they're going to carry all the way through into the Civil War. Again, people didn't want to pay taxes for roads and canals in other states. This here, I'm just talking about economic panics and tended to be cyclical. They happened on a fairly regular basis every 20 years or so, maybe 15 years, maybe 25 years. But in roughly a 20-year cycle, you see economic panics where you see an increase in the economy, and then there's a recession. And there's growth, then there's a recession. And 1819, 1837, 20 years later in 57, a little less than 20 years later in 1873, and then again in 1893. So throughout the 19th century, we had a almost predictable cycle of growth, and then not quite the Great Depression, but severe drop-offs, recessions. Results of the different economic panic, especially the economic panic of 1819, you'd see bankruptcies, companies going out of business. Of course, companies go out of business, people lose their jobs, people can't pay their bills, they lose their farms, they lose their homes. You see deflation in the value of a dollar, drop in prices because, it also depends. You might have deflation of the dollar, but at the same time, prices go up because as more companies close, production becomes more difficult. So price goes up because production costs more or is more difficult, and the value of the dollar goes down. That's what we refer to as inflation. Deflation could be a drop in prices. You could see a fluctuation in the value of currency. So all of those things are hard. Out west, Westerners were probably hit the worst by the Panic of 1819. The Bank of the United States started calling in loans because of the economic hardship, and these, as they referred to them, wildcat banks that the Bank of the United States had loaned money to, so these banks could start up to make loans to people that wanted to buy land as they moved and settled out west. These banks start to go bankrupt. When the banks go bankrupt and they start calling in their loans because the Bank of the United States is calling in the loan on the Wildcat Bank, farmers can't pay all that money back to the bank, so the bank ends up foreclosing. Farmers end up losing their farms. The Bank of the United States ends up getting the blame, and that's going to end up putting the Bank of the United States in the crosshairs of Andrew Jackson as he starts pushing towards gaining the presidency a few years down the road. The number of people that go to prison because they had defaulted on loans, they were debtors, goes through the roof. By 1819, 9 frontier states had joined the original 13. We're up to 22 states. You see them being admitted, like I say, alternately. You admit a free state, admit a slave state, admit a free state, admit a slave state. The urge to push west was big at this point. Reasons for expansion, like I said, the soil depletion has always been an issue. Move west to untouched land. And then because they were still using antiquated methods of farming, they weren't doing crop rotation like they should have been. They're still going to deplete the soil and continue to have to move farther west. But, there was a need there that to have thriving crops, they did need to move west. As improvements to roads, canals, things like that take place, travel is going to be easier. Steamboats by the early 1800s, the steamboat had come into use, so that makes two-way river travel possible, because before the steamboat, you basically traveled downstream. You just rode the current. With a steamboat, now steamboats with a steam-powered engine, they could actually go upstream, relatively easily. Passage of the Land Act in 1820 allowed buyers to purchase 80 acres at a minimum, which this is extremely cheap, $1.25 per acre. Wildcat banks, they were created. They would take loans from the Bank of the United States, and they would take the money that they got to start up a bank. Then they would loan money out to farmers that were going to, take advantage of the Land Act of 1820. Now, again, as people start to move westward, an issue is going to be slavery. This is something that would pop up from time to time, but really hadn't been a major issue since the founding of the nation. Again, southern states, they were, when it was brought up, writing up the Constitution of the United States, that's something that they didn't really support. So they threatened to back out. Slavery is dropped from discussion. As more people start to move west, in 1819, Missouri was seeking admission to the Union as a slave state, and you had an equal balance of slave states to free states. If Missouri got admitted as a slave state, that would tip the balance pro-slavery. Northern states weren't willing to give in to this. In the House, you had the Tallmadge Amendment. It was going to limit slavery in Missouri. If Missouri becomes a state, the proposal was that no more slaves would be allowed in Missouri. Slaves that already lived with their masters in the Missouri Territory would be allowed, but no new slaves could be brought into Missouri. The second part of the amendment was that slaves born in Missouri to slave parents would gradually be emancipated. When I say gradually emancipated, over time they would slowly gain rights until they were completely free. Now, it was voted down in the Senate where Southern states had an equal vote because we had an equal number of slave states and free states, and slave state, senators were not going to vote in favor of any limitation to slavery, because the way that they looked at it, if they gave in to any limitation of slavery, that was the first step towards eventually abolishing slavery. And even at this point, and I'll talk about this more as we get closer to the Civil War, as morally corrupt as the Institute of Slavery was, the Southern states had built their economies, their agrarian economies, their farming economies, around the institution of slavery. With the plantation system, if they did not have slaves, free slave labor, their economies, as poor as Southern states tended to be already, their economies would have all been a shambles if it hadn't been for slave labor. So that's why you're never going to have Southern representatives or senators voting in favor of any limitation or any proposal to abolish slavery. Now, this leads to the Missouri Compromise, because if they couldn't come to some agreement between the House and the Senate, some agreement in Congress, Missouri's just going to sit in limbo as a territory. So the road to statehood being blocked, the Missouri Compromise ends up being the agreement to move the process of Missouri achieving statehood, move it forward. Missouri would be admitted as a slave state, but to maintain the balance of free and slave states, Maine would also be admitted as a free state. So now, instead of 22 states, 11 and 11, we're admitting 2 states at the same time, 1 free, 1 slave. Now we maintain the balance at 12 free, 12 slave. Now, in terms of territory for future states, there was a line that was drawn from east to west at 36 degrees and 30 minutes. All new states north of that line would end up being free states. All states south of that line would be slave states. 36 degrees, 30 minutes just happens to be the southern border of Missouri. So the United States Congress is taking a stance here and saying that while they are allowing for the expansion of slavery, the intended northern advancement of slavery is going to be Missouri. No farther north than Missouri from this point forward. The Missouri Compromise is going to end up working for 26 years. As new lands end up being acquired from Mexico, that starts to open up the question as to what to do about the issue of slavery, or as it was referred to in speeches in Congress, that peculiar institution. Moving back to talk about the Supreme Court, John Marshall and judicial nationalism. Like I said, John Marshall was a Federalist, and since the Constitution was adopted in 1789, there had been the argument for states' rights. Anti-Federalists, Democratic Republicans, now it's starting to turn into a North versus South, even by 1820 issue. Southerners, which far and wide were Democratic Republicans, had been anti-Federalists. They supported the issue of states' rights, that states were too restricted and the federal government had too much power. After the Supreme Court establishes judicial review in 1803 as a significant power, you're going to see John Marshall and the Supreme Court end up exercising that authority, and this really decides the debate about states' rights in the span of a handful of court cases. McCulloch versus Maryland, this is also referred to as the Elastic Clause case. Again, the Elastic Clause was Alexander Hamilton's interpretation of how you look at the Constitution. that it was a flexible document, like elastic. It has some stretch, it has some give, as opposed to a very concrete, a very literal interpretation of the Constitution. Well, what happens here is Maryland tried to tax the Bank of the United States. Chief Justice Marshall invoked Alexander Hamilton's so-called implied powers and declared the Bank of the United States constitutional. Maryland was not allowed to tax them. So this gives some legal foundation to the elastic clause interpretation, that the Constitution had been written in general terms as opposed to specific terms. This is a win for federalism over states' rights. Cohen's versus Virginia, a lottery case. The Cohen's family had sold lottery tickets in Virginia, which was illegal by state law. They argued that there was a federal law saying that it was legal and that federal law trumps state law. The Supreme Court reviewed. They showed that it had the power to review state court decisions. So court decisions made on the local level can be appealed at a higher court at the state level. Cases decided at the state level can be appealed one level up at the federal level. So this is a win for the federal government. The federal courts trump state courts, federal laws trump state laws. This is a second win for federalism as opposed to states' rights. Gibbons versus Ogden, the steamboat case. Robert Fulton had invented the steamboat in the early 1800s, and he had hired Gibbons to pilot a boat along the Hudson River, across the Hudson River, north and south, up and down the Hudson River. And the state of New York had awarded them monopoly rights to do so. Now, because they had been awarded monopoly rights, Ogden starts running his own boat, which violates Fulton's rights to monopolize transportation up and down the Hudson. He was prosecuted, he was convicted. The importance there is New York couldn't award a monopoly because the Constitution says only Congress can regulate interstate trade, trade between states, and along the Hudson River you can gain access to other states. If this was a river just in New York, then New York would have been able to grant monopoly rights. Again, the lawsuit against Ogden where he was convicted, that would have been at a state level. When it gets appealed at the federal level, that's when they say New York didn't have the right to give Fulton a monopoly because the Hudson River touched more than one state. Congress is the only one that can regulate trade between states. Another win for federalism. Fletcher versus Peck, 1810, the land scam contract case. Right here, there's a contract that a law ends up being passed that revokes a previous contract in the state of Georgia. The Supreme Court, it was appealed at the federal level. The Supreme Court steps in and says a contract is a legally binding document. The Constitution says it cannot be broken by state laws. It's another win for federalism. Dartmouth College versus Woodward, the college charter case. Dartmouth College had been awarded a charter by King George III during the colonial period, but later on New Hampshire, the state government of New Hampshire revoked it. Dartmouth College argued that they had already been chartered. They shouldn't be able to be revoked and shut down by the state government because it's a legal document. They appeal at the federal level. Supreme Court says that the charter is a contract, just like in the previous case I talked about, and that states could not encroach on contracts even if it was signed before the formation of the United States as a government. Another win for the federal government. Clear patterns emerging. The federal government has more authority than the state governments do. State rights, the argument for states' rights is taking a lot of losses here. Now, in terms of shaping the nation, more fully, we have the Treaty of 1818 with England over the American-Canadian border. We end up drawing a border line at 49 degrees from Lake of the Woods, Minnesota, west to the Rocky Mountains. Later on, we'll end up establishing the rest of the border from the Rocky Mountains to the Pacific Ocean. Fishing waters of Newfoundland would be shared between the British and the Americans. For the time, Oregon would jointly be occupied, but like I said, that would be decided a little later on. Florida had been a problem for the United States since our country's formation. Florida changed hands frequently, going back and forth between the British and the Spanish. The Spanish regained control of Florida in the 1810s, or the 18 teens. Florida ends up being a home for runaway slaves, Indian tribes that would continue to cause problems for people in Georgia, the Carolinas, Alabama. Andrew Jackson got the okay from Congress to enter Florida to capture runaway slaves, to punish Native Americans that had made attacks, maybe or maybe not, against American settlements. A few leaders, Native American and English, end up being hung. 2 Spanish outposts were captured by Americans in the Florida Panhandle. The Spanish governor of Florida manages to escape. Jackson had vastly overstepped his orders, but Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, the son of former President John Adams, wasn't going to give up the land that we already had taken control of. This leads to the Florida Purchase Treaty that we made with Spain. We pay Spain $5 million for the acquisition of Florida. Spain gives up claim to Oregon, and America gives up claim to Texas. Oregon's southern boundary, because Spain still controlled California, but we set Oregon's southern border at 42 degrees latitude. Now it's just the issue of we need to decide where the border between Great Britain and the United States is going to be. Okay, this slide here, the one thing that I do want to mention is that by the time we get to 1820 or so, we are starting to see, we as Americans are starting to worry that things are beginning to revert back to their old ways after the French Revolution, after Napoleon's advances in Europe, that Europe wanted to return to the old days of the monarchy. Steps were taken in Europe for monarchs and aristocrats to reassert control that they had lost during Napoleon's wars. This worried Americans because they might travel across the Atlantic and they might start to come back into the Americas, just as we start to assume, our authority on this continent. Russia had slowly but surely in the West been creeping down the border of the Pacific Northwest, all the way down to 51 degrees, not far from that gray area where the British and the Americans had dual claims. The Russians had trading posts as far south as San Francisco. England was also, plotting and scheming. British Foreign Secretary George Canning offers a deal to the American Foreign Minister in London. He proposes that the United States and England go in together. They make a joint statement that neither one of them would grab any Latin American land, and they would warn other European nations to stay out of Latin America as well. The American representative basically said, I'm going to have to talk to my boss. He communicates with President James Monroe. This is an offer that the British have made, and Monroe's like, tell him we'll think about it. He looks at the proposal. The Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, looks at the proposal as well, and they don't really trust the British here. Why would the United States tie our hands towards future expansion? Why do we need, as a North American nation, why do we need England to step in and make this statement with us to the rest of Europe? The British Navy would keep order in Latin America for British shipping, whether the United States was with them or not. So President Monroe goes ahead and releases the Monroe Doctrine in 1823 that says 2 things. It asserts, it pushes for European non-colonization of the Americas. You all have your own continent in the Americas. We will be the I guess you could say, the policeman of the Americas, and it also pushed for European non-intervention. Essentially, this was the United States kind of puffing its chest out and telling Europe that the days of colonization in the Americas are over, that European states should stay out of American affairs, whether it's North America, Central America, Latin America, or South America. This was a keep out sign planted in the Americas to the rest of the world. Now, a lot of people thought that it was directed, Americans and Europeans thought that this was actually directed at Great Britain, but it wasn't. You know, we were saying it to all of Europe, but we were kind of side-eyeing Russia the whole time that this statement is being made. It's kind of like in class, if I have a classroom full of students, which in 2020 seems like a really weird statement to make, but I have a classroom full of students and I see one student with their phone out when the phones are supposed to be put away. And I say, it'd be a shame if I saw somebody with their phone out. Instead of singling one person out, I'm making a general statement to everybody. That's what the United States, that's what President Monroe is doing. He's making a general statement, but he has a specific target for that statement. In return for Europeans staying out of American affairs, the United States agrees to stay out of the Greek and Turkish fight. We'll stay out of European affairs. You all stay out of affairs here in the continents of the Americas. You know, if you have an issue with what's going on in some Latin American or Central American country, talk to us. We'll handle it for you. You know, if Costa Rica owes the English money, tell us. We'll get your money, and you know, you don't have to come interfere in our backyard. That's basically what it boils down to. And we also make the agreement that if there are any things going on, you know, a fight for democracy in Greece to break away, create an independent Greek state from the Turks, we'll stay out of that fight. It's none of our business. Europe wasn't happy about the Monroe Doctrine. Again, all we had done was beat the British in the War of 1812. You know, this comes off as a young upstart nation, you know, being a little too big for their britches. We had snubbed the British, but the British, again, this shows how far we had come in just a few short years in terms of our relationship with the British government, even though they weren't happy about it. And we had undercut the British offer made to our diplomat there in England. The British Navy actually upheld the Monroe Doctrine. Latin America wasn't exactly enthusiastic about the doctrine either. They understood that the British Navy supplied the muscle. The United States government was simply looking out for our own interests, and they had to realize that maybe at some point we would start, you know, looking to the South, possibly for expansion, for resources, whatever the case might be. The Monroe Doctrine had, you know, little effect at the time, but farther down the road, decades down the road, actually, it's going to grow in stature, in power, and influence. The Russians had started drawing back even before the doctrine, but especially after the announcement is made, you know, you do start to see, you know, it makes it seem like the doctrine was that much more enforceful. The Russo-American Treaty of 1824 sets the southern boundary of Russian land at 54 degrees and 40 minutes as opposed to 51 degrees. So they ended up withdrawing, you know, quite a bit farther north. The doctrine was not law. It was basically just an announcement by the president at the time. The next president could undo the Monroe Doctrine if he so wished. The good effect of the Monroe Doctrine, you know, it showed American nationalism. It showed that we had a growing influence on the world stage. A bad effect is that, you know, it made Americans think that they were isolated from what was going on in Europe just because, you know, our government had said, you know, we don't want to be involved there. We don't want you involved here. And that brings us to the end of chapter 12. Like I said, I should be getting all of these posted here before long. Again, I know this was another long video. I don't expect you to watch them all in one chunk. Break it up, watch 5-10 minutes here just to watch what little bit you need explanation on. If you do have any further questions or anything like that, feel free to email me. Feel free to make a comment in the Google Classroom, and jump into one of the Google Meets that I have each day, and we can either talk about things, or I mean, if I have to, I guess I could make another video about a specific issue and give more explanation to it if we couldn't handle it over email or something like that. But as of right now, I hope you all had a good Thanksgiving. I hope you have a Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, and fingers crossed. Hope we get to see each other in January. Talk to you later.